Hello and welcome everyone to Open Classroom, the Brown School's digital forum for community and conversation. My name is Sarah Sims. I am the manager of continuing education for the Brown School here at Washington University in St. Louis. And I would also like to introduce real quickly and welcome my colleague and the facilitator for today, Amber Brown, who is our manager of career services at the Brown School. She will be moderating the question and answer portion at the end of today's program. Before we get started, I do want to do just some brief housekeeping items. First, we are using a Zoom webinar format, which means that we can't see or hear you, but we do still want to engage with you through the chat. The chat is open and we welcome your comments and questions throughout the program today. You can also feel free to say hello right now and where you're zooming in from if you like. We are also streaming live on YouTube. I will drop a link to that in the chat in just a moment, so you can share with anybody who wasn't able to register for the Zoom. However, want to make sure you know that we aren't able to moderate the Q&A on YouTube. All right, so for today's program, this is the second in our Black History Month series. Although today is the first official day of Black History Month, we did do one of our series last week, which you can view on our YouTube channel. I want to thank the Brown School's Black History Month committee, which is led by the co-chairs Amber Brown and Cynthia Williams, for putting together this year's amazing programming. I invite you to visit our Black History Month webpage. Again, I'll put that in the chat in just a moment. There you can learn more about this year's Black History Month theme. You can learn about the rest of the programming that we're offering, as well as the champions that we're celebrating. And so speaking of the champions, one of those champions is today's speaker, Dr. Sheretta Butler-Barnes. Dr. Butler-Barnes is a developmental psychologist and has expertise and scholarly work on the impact of racism and the use of culturally strength-based assets on the educational and health outcomes of Black American families. She is also an associate professor here at the Brown School of Social Work. Dr. Butler-Barnes received her PhD and MA from Wayne State University in psychology and her BS in psychology from Michigan State University. The two lines of her research agenda include one, Black Families and Racial Justice Project, which is a mixed methodological investigation of Black families' vulnerability to or resistance against marginalization, focusing on the parenting practices and adolescent developmental trajectories. The other piece of research is the Study for Black Women and Project, which focuses on advancing equity for women and girls of color by identifying risk and protective factors in learning spaces and create culturally responsive programming that promotes resiliency. So please everyone join me in welcoming Dr. Sheretta Barnes, who is here to discuss related stress, parent practices, and social messages of Blackness. Take it away, Dr. Barnes.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I am now going to share my screen with you all. Okay, give it a go. Can someone let me know if they see this? Yes?
Yes.
You do? Okay, good. Thank you all, and I'm so happy that you all can join me today. Today is, and I'll sort of go through it. I'm going to be talking about which is a bittersweet day for me because today is the day of Tyre Nichols' funeral, and the scholarship that I'm going to be presenting to you all today is on racial violence specifically and how Black parents are engaging and how having conversations with their children about race and racism in America. And so this is one of the most difficult presentations that I've had to do in my career so far, but I think that this is very important work. And I'm hoping that at the end of this conversation, the end of this presentation, that we can engage in some conversation on ways that we can support Black families. And so again, welcome and thank you for having me. The title of this talk is Give Me the Strength, Race-Related Stress, Parenting Practices, and Socialization Messages of Black Parents. And before we get started, I just want to note that this is important work that I'm going to be presenting to you all. This is work that is a collaborative project. It's also with Dr. Shauna Leith, who is a professor here at WashU, and she's in the Department of Psychology, and my other colleague, Bridget Cheeks, who's at University of North Carolina, Greensboro. And so it's a lot in terms of doing this work. And one of the things that is most distressing is that we have to add Tyre Nichols' name here to the list of names that we talk to about Black families. And so at this time, his funeral will be at 1 o'clock today. I just want to send blessings and love and healing to his mom. And so I just want to just sort of center Tyre Nichols right now. So let's get to the presentation. And so today I'm going to be introducing to you all why this work is important. I am going to ground it in a conceptual framework that is culturally responsive to the needs of Black families. And I'm going to present some of our early research findings that we're really excited about. And then I want to talk about next steps in this project and where we are going to go from here. And so I think if you know me, you know that I always want to start off with positionality. And those of you who've attended my talks before know this is something that I always do. And it's important for a couple of reasons, because I think it's important that you all know what sort of brought me to this scholarship and what brought me to this work. And so I am from Detroit, Michigan. I was raised in a socioeconomically and culturally diverse community, Black families. What does culturally diverse means? It means that Black families are not a monolith. And so I had Nigerian families, Black immigrant families that were within my community, Caribbean Black families, those persons who were descendants of enslaved enslaved Africans. And so I say that to say the beauty in terms of how I've always saw Black families has always been not from a monolith lens, but a lens that I was able to understand, experience, and also understand the cultural experiences. And so from there, living within that community, I attended gifted and talented, predominantly Black schools in Detroit public school system. And it's not until I went to Michigan State as an undergrad student where the world that I know was sort of challenged in ways in which how scientists talked about Black families in a very cultural deficit way. And so I knew from my experience being around a socioeconomically diverse, culturally diverse community of Black families, I knew that that was not the lens that one should have, particularly when we talk about inner sciences and sort of helping families. And so from then on, I sort of had this mission on when I talk about Black families, it will always be from a culturally strength-based asset. And I will also give Black families the opportunity to talk about their resistance and their resilient narrative. So them sort of owning their own voice and telling their own stories. And so I always talk about the positionality because it sort of centers the work that I do as a scholar here at WashU. And so I also want to talk a little bit about the work that I do at the Black Families Racism and Resilience Lab, that's located at Del Mar Divine. This sort of centered on 3 projects, the Black Families and Racial Justice Project. These are some of the findings that I'm going to present to you all today. We have the Equity for Black Women and Girls Project that centers on developing and implementing culturally responsive programming for Black women and girls. And the last project is Strength-Based Assets of Black Adolescents. This study really gets at the racialized experiences of Black youth, whether they're in school settings or whether they're in community settings, and particularly how Black youth are sort of navigating racialized experiences. And so again, for the purposes of today's presentation, I am going to center and talk about the Black Families and Racial Justice Project. And so why is this work important? And so for this work, it was important that we centered the Black families in the St. Louis region. Because in 2014, the death of Mike Brown, you are familiar with, a teenager from here, led to a state of civil unrest and served as a catalyst for the 2016 Black Lives Matter movement. In reaction to his murder and the response from police forces against Black communities in the STL area, The NAACP travel advisory informed Black Americans to proceed with caution when traveling through the state of Missouri. In addition to that, in 2016, there were student protests over race relations at the University of Missouri in Columbia. And then also in our K through 12 system, here, Black students were protesting at suburban school districts and elite private schools around treatment within the classroom, around the way that they were being viewed. And so this sort of was a catalyst in the state of Missouri around these sort of racialized sort of interactions and these conversations that was beginning to take place. And so also because of this increased visibility of police violence against Black teens, this impacted how Black parents are engaging with their children, having conversations about race and racism. And so there are a couple of studies that have looked at this as well. One was in response to Trayvon Martin, and the other was in response to Mike Brown. And so, for example, in response to George Zimmerman murdering 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in 2012 due to suspicious behavior, Thomas and her colleagues found that a number of Black parents felt that Trayvon Martin's death was a result of racial profiling and that young Black men need to be protected. Participants also expressed how enraged they were and how at a loss they were across the country because of George Zimmerman acquittal. And so because of the violence that we're tending to see throughout the media and the way in which Black parents sort of have to contend and sort of protecting their children and having these conversations, Black parents are worried about their child dying from the possibility of violence or death due to racism. And so why did I want to center Black families in Missouri? Number one, there's a history of racial violence in the state of Missouri. And although racial incidences have occurred within the past 9 years, Black families have been impacted around these conversations. And also, the history of Missouri involves a legacy of racial violence and also being part of the Southern Confederacy. And for those of you who did not know, Missouri has some of the highest rates in the nation of killing Black men. And so it's important for me to give you all that context in terms of Missouri and why it's important and why in this particular project, we wanted to intentionally center the voices of Black families and really understanding how and to what extent they were having conversations with their child about race and racism in America. And so in order for me to be able to do this and to do this in a way that I honored the voices of Black families, I drew on the socio-historical integrative model for the study of stress in Black families. This is a model that I was fortunate to collaborate with Velma Murray, who is at Vanderbilt University, who has a long-standing longitudinal study on the experiences of rural Black families in the state of Georgia. We wanted to have a model that was centered on the experiences of Black families in America. And one of those sort of at the starting point, it was important for us to recognize the historical vestiges of slavery and Jim Crow laws, specifically race-related economic, social, and political history of where Black families are at and how Black families are situated, because that will lead to these current socio-contextual stressors, racism, prejudice, discrimination, oppression, and also being marginalized. We was also interested in the social positioning of one. So that's their race, ethnicity, their social class and their gender. And then also I was specifically interested in the race-related sort of daily hassles that families had to contend with. And then also the extent to which it impacted parents and families' psychological and emotional functioning. And again, this work was very important, and using this model not only sort of underscored the importance of this work, but also the importance of using a theoretical model that was centered on the needs of Black families and sort of highlighted the unique racialized experiences within the US. And so I say that to say that this work that we do is very much grounded in this model for the study of stress in Black families. And so now we get to racial socialization, these conversations that Black parents are having with their children, that families of color are having. And so this represents family communications to youth about how to feel and think about their racial group membership, and really how to understand and cope with discrimination. there's a plethora of studies that have linked racial socialization messages to higher adaptive coping with discrimination. And so what does that mean? Black parents who are engaging in having conversations with their child about racial discrimination, about what it means to be Black in America, about how to be safe, the racial barriers that Black youth might encounter. This is leading Black youth, serving as a protective mechanism in a way that when they do experience racial discrimination, they remember the messages of their parents. And so racial socialization has also been linked to a healthy racial identity. So that means that parents who are engaging in this conversation, Black youth are able to see themselves in positive ways when they encounter a negative racialized experiences within their communities or in the school setting. And so one of the things that I always do is, sometimes there's confusion about what racial socialization is. And so it's more than just telling a child that he, she, they are Black, but it's also sort of specific sort of messaging. And so I always show a clip that sort of documents this. And so I'm going to show this to you all now so you have an idea of what racial socialization looks like, but really understanding that it varies as well.
Who said that?
The lady at the store.
That is not a compliment.
Listen, it's an ugly, nasty word, and you are going to hear it. Nothing I can do about that. But you are not going to let that word hurt you. You hear me?
There are some people who think you don't deserve the same privileges just because of what you look like. It's not fair. It's not.
Remember, you can do anything they can. The difference is you gotta work twice as hard and be twice as smart.
Come straight home after practice. You got your ID? Oh, guess I stopped you.
How's your review?
We're good.
You good?
Yeah,
You see?
We're good.
Okay.
Good.
Now, when you get pulled over,
I'm a good driver. Okay?
baby,
Don't worry.
this is not about you getting a ticket. This is about you not coming home.
I'm gonna be okay. Right? Okay.
Baby.
It's not fair. But you keep showing up.
You are not pretty for a Black girl. You are beautiful, period. Okay? Don't ever forget that.
Okay, and so that's just a clip that I like to show that really sort of highlights the diversity within the conversations in terms of how racial socialization messages are communicated to Black youth. And I also want to sort of give an acknowledgement, and also the folks whose shoulders I stand on in terms of doing this work on racial socialization and sort of honoring those who have began to look at these things very early on in terms of the messaging aspect of it. And so for me also trying to pick a scale or a measure to really understand particularly how Black parents were having conversations, not just racial socialization in terms of frequency of messaging, but specifically around racial violence. This is something that I wanted to do. And so all of these scales in some capacity highlights the frequency at which Black parents are having conversation with their children. So the amount of messaging, while others sort of highlight this idea of teaching or modeling to my child about how to deal with race and racism. I was specifically interested in the sort of how Black parents were having conversations about racial violence, but also the affective component. And so I ended up using Anderson and Stevenson scale as well. And then I also want to give a nod to Wilma King, who did some engaged in archival research and really went back and looked at those transcripts in terms of sort of understanding how slave parents were talking to their youth at that time. And this is archival data, and she was able to sort of pull messaging together from slave youth in the 19th century. So I just want to say that this is not something that Black parents do as a result of something that happens or trends in the media, but this is something that Black families have almost always had to do when raising Black children in America. And so I am using Anderson and Stevenson's racial encounter, coping, appraisal, and socialization theory. So this is a culturally relevant framework for understanding racial socialization processes through the context of race-related violence and trauma. And recast suggests that both these sort of direct and vicarious experiences of racial discrimination can result in the manifestation of race-based traumatic stress. And so again, it was very important for me to sort of extend the research literature by not necessarily looking at the frequency of messaging, but how are parents feeling and coping with their own racialized experience before they engage in having conversations to their children. And again, honoring those who have done this work, but also wanting to extend this research literature a bit. And so it's important because parents who are dealing with the challenge of managing their own stress from discrimination, they're also grappling at the same time with really trying to understand the best ways to provide effective racial socialization messaging to their child, whether it's through messages, stories, teachings, or behaviors. And so recast also suggests that the racial socialization competency, not the frequency, right? But the competency in terms of how parents feel they're skilled or confidently prepared to engage in this communication really does matter. And if parents are not feeling their best or are struggling with their own racialized experiences, this indeed is going to impact the type of communication that they're having. And so again, it's this emphasis on the development of a skill as opposed to the frequency of it. And so for this particular presentation, this is me, sort of presenting our preliminary findings from year one of our data collection. I wanted to really center Black parents and center Black parents intentionally to understand how their race-related stressors, their reports of daily racism, being exposed to racial violence through the media, how did that impact the type of messaging they were given to their children around, were they confident? Did Black parents feel skillful as if they can engage in this? And did they also feel as if they can prepare their child to address inequities? And that's the call to action piece. But then I was also interested in how race-related stressors also involve vigilant parenting. And this is the type of parenting where parents are overprotective. Our parents are sort of this high level of monitoring as a result of Black parents being exposed to race-related stressors in their own lives, but also through the media. Excuse me. And then this last piece of it, trauma by discrimination, this was important for me because I felt as if for us, if we were looking at race-related stressors, what is the extent to which Black parents might be traumatized by their own discrimination experiences, and how might that moderate the relationship between race-related stressors and racial socialization, them feeling competent or not, and also the type of parenting practice. And so this was very important for me to understand. And so again, it's not the frequency, but it really is the effective component about how Black parents are feeling with their own race-related stressors. And also, are they traumatized by their own race-related experiences and the extent to which they feel confident, skillful to engage in communication to their child about race and racism in America. And so let me talk to you a little bit about the recruitment in St. Louis. And so what we did was we recruited Black families from January of 2022 throughout the spring and summer. And so we advertised at places of worship. We went to school districts, advertised at school districts, and I want to give a shout out to Better Family Life, Sister Deborah, and also Brother Jahid, and sort of helping us do this work in a youth and family center. They allow for our team to come and to have space with them and to share and really helped us with recruitment of Black families. We also went to Black businesses, beauty salons, barbershops, restaurants. We sent it out to our national panhandle organizations. We were at the St. Louis Housing Authority. We advertised through WashU's campus. We also relied on the snowballing technique. And we also attended festivals over the summer too, the Juneteenth Festival and the African Festival. And so we intentionally wanted to, again, center the voices of Black families. And so that led to us, we have approximately 920 parent-child dyads of Black families in Missouri. This is year one. And I also want to say year one because this is a longitudinal study. And so these families will be followed over time. And so this is just year one. We're gearing up for data collection in the next couple of months. Black families are from rural, urban, and suburban communities here. 55% of the sample was mothers. The mean age was 37. On average, parents' income was between $35,000 to $50,000 per year. Parents reported an associate's degree or some college, and participants were given a $25 incentive. And so some of the measures we used to really understand what was happening in Black parents, sort of the messaging in the state of Missouri. And so for demographics, we consider parents' age, their relationship to the child, their education, income, and the number of children in a household. And one of the scales that we used was Harrell's scale, right? And this was the racial discrimination scale. And what's interesting about this particular scale, what's unique about it is that it's not only asking Black parents about the frequency of their racialized experience, but it's also asking them how bothered they are by it. And so one of the sample questions in the past year, how often have you been ignored, overlooked, or not given service because of your race? So parents would state the frequency of that, but then also they would state how bothered they were by that. And so for racial violence, we assess parents' experiences of witnessing traumatic race-related events through social media, for example, Twitter, Facebook, or online news websites, and it was assessed over the past year. So 2 items we used during the past year: I have seen images or videos of others from my ethnic group being arrested or detained. And during the past year, I have seen a viral video of a Black person being shot by a police officer. And so these were the items that we asked Black parents around racial violence through the media. And then the trauma symptoms of discrimination. And so parents' psychological and emotional stress reactions to racism was assessed. And so, for example, a sample question was, due to past experiences of discrimination, I often cannot stop or control my worrying. And so I also want to note that this is different from the racial discrimination of being bothered. And so parents would know how bothered they were, but the difference between that discrimination being bothered and a trauma symptoms of discrimination scale is that parents are impacted in ways in which they can't stop or control worrying. It's impacting their sleep, it's impacting their eating patterns. And so this really does lead to us trying to understand race-based PTSD. And so this is why this particular scale is important. And we felt that it was important, specifically in talking about racial violence and racial discrimination. And with the racial socialization competency scale, this assessed parent socialization competencies. Again, how confident parents are in engaging in conversations about race and racism, how skillful they feel. Do they feel like they have the skills to do it? And also, the extent to which they can feel that they can prepare their child to address inequities in society. And so the questions, I believe I can, I am or will be prepared to, I am or would be stressed to. And so this is what parents were prompted with when we asked them those questions. And so the Involved Vigilant Parenting Scale is a scale that I used from the Family and Community Health Study. This is Velma Murray's study at Vanderbilt. And this has pretty much assessed the combination of parental monitoring and reasoning and problem solving. And so this idea is that involved vigilant parenting is going to increase as a result of Black parents being exposed to higher levels of racial violence and reporting higher levels of racial discrimination. And so this leads to some of the findings, the mean and standard deviation. I would not go over this table, but I do want to note that, because this is not where the important findings are at, but it does give us an idea about sort of the averages and where families fell at. And so collectively, we had low to moderate levels of parents being bothered by discrimination and sort of reporting high amounts of racial discrimination. There are parents that are feeling somewhat confident, skillful, and feeling as if, they can prepare their child to address inequities. And there is some amount of Black parents being traumatized by their own racial discrimination experiences. And so those are some of the things I wanted to point out with the mean and standard deviation table. And so the correlation table, again, just to sort of, highlight, the directionality of where we were going before we decided to sort of run further analysis. And so this sort of indicated to us that, the measures were aligned appropriately in terms of the direction and the and how it was associated with each other. And so what I have highlighted, for example, is that racial violence was associated with parents feeling less confident, less skillful, and engaging in less sort of ways to prepare their child for inequities. And it also was associated with being hyper involved in terms of vigilant parenting. And so for us, those the directionality was in the correct way in terms of how we hypothesize that. And so now we get to the findings. And so something to note about a multivariate linear regression analysis. It is very huge. It is a big table. And so for the purposes of this presentation, I am presenting each outcome separately, if that makes sense, so that we were able to sort of process and look at the findings of this work. And so the results, and this is for the racial socialization confident outcome. And so this is for Black parents in terms of reporting how confident they feel in engaging in these conversations. And so what you see in terms of the being highlighted were the variables that was statistically significant. And so what we see here is that Black parents who reported in higher income, they felt more confident in engaging in conversations around race and racism. The relationship to the child mattered in such a way that Black mothers reported feeling less confident in engaging and talking to their children about race and racism in America. And what we have here are two direct effects. So Black parents who reported higher levels of experiencing their own discrimination in terms of the frequency of it, they felt more confident in having conversations with their child. And so one can say, people are usually surprised by this finding, but because if you go back to the Black families and stress model, because racism is a mundane, extreme environmental stressor and is a lived experience of Black families, it does make sense that Black parents who are reporting higher levels of racial discrimination feel as if they can talk to their child about race and racism in America because of their own lived experiences. And so when we looked at that, that made sense to us. In terms of racial discrimination, the frequency of it, that made sense. But however, Black parents who were bothered by racial discrimination, they felt less confident. They did not feel as confident to engage their child in conversations about race and racism in America. And the two variables that you all see, the TD, time, RDF, and RV, those are significant interactions, and I'm going to explain them on the next slide, which is now. And so in terms of the low slope here, under conditions where Black parents reported experiencing higher amounts of racial discrimination, but yet they weren't as traumatized by discrimination. And so again, they're experiencing racial discrimination at high levels, but they're not ruminating about it as much. They felt confident as if they can have conversations with their child about race and racism. And so they were more likely to be confident. And so here we see something that is the opposite. And so when there is low racial violence present, meaning that parents are not reporting lower levels of sort of viewing the media and reporting seeing Black Americans being violated, and then also if they are highly traumatized by discrimination. So no presence of racial violence, little to no presence of racial violence through the media, but still they're ruminating about their own racialized experiences. Black parents do not feel confident having a conversation with their child about race and racism. And so it's the simple fact that they are ruminating and thinking about their own experiences is particularly important to note. But I also want you all to pay attention to this particular slope here, which is statistically significant in the sense that as you go across, when Black parents are beginning to report, though, higher levels of racial violence, it doesn't matter if they are traumatized or not, they are still going to try to engage in conversations with their youth. And so the presence of racial violence outside of them being traumatized makes them want to engage in these conversations and feel more confident about it. And so in terms of Black parents feeling skillful, we see the same relationship. Income matters, relationship to the child matters. Again, Black parents, the frequency of racism, they feel more skillful. If they're bothered by their own racial discrimination experiences, they do not feel as skillful. And we see here, we have two significant interactions. And we see, again, sort of similar patterns with Black parents and feeling confident. Black parents who are exposed to higher amounts of racial discrimination, but yet they're not as traumatized by discrimination. They feel more skillful in engaging in conversations with their child. Let's see here, and then we go to the next slide. We see here in terms of, I'm sorry, I went too far. It jumped a bit. Okay, now this is the correct slide. In terms of here, we see the same thing that's happening when there's little to low racial violence sort of present in Black parents' lives, but yet they're still sort of traumatized by their own racialized experiences. They feel less skillful. However, when racial violence is present, something that's happening through the media, them being traumatized by discrimination doesn't matter. They're still going to engage in conversations with their child, and they feel more skillful about engaging in this. And so now we get to a call to action, and we see something that's a little bit different here. In terms of age, older African-American parents were less likely to encourage or to have conversations with their child in terms of addressing inequities. Income mattered here. Black parents reported a higher levels of their income. They sort of spoke more about sort of engaging, preparing their child to engage in addressing inequities. The number of children mattered, more number of children. They feel that they can sort of have them engage in this call to action. The relationship to the child mattered again in ways in which Black mothers felt less likely to do this. And then we have our direct effects again, very similar way, right? Very similar sort of direction. Racial discrimination, the frequency, Black parents feel like, okay, I can prepare you to talk about and address inequities in society. However, if they were bothered by it, they did not encourage their child, were less likely to encourage their child to, and provide them with ways on how to address inequities in society. And we have another statistical interaction. It's a lot of interactions, y'all. I mean, I hope you all are following me, but open to the questions at the very end of this presentation as well. And so we see here, very similar to the rest of the models in terms of the directionality. When Black parents are reporting these higher levels of being, of experiencing racism, those who are not as traumatized from their racial discrimination experiences feel as if they can engage and prepare their child to address inequities in society. So that is that call to action that's particularly important. And lastly, we have involved vigilant parenting. And this is something that's a little bit different. And so we have some variables that are now statistically significant. And so let me highlight the fact that Black parents who reported experiencing racial violence through the media, they felt as if they had to be involved, you know, it led to more like hyper-vigilant parenting. And so they reported higher levels of monitoring, higher levels of being involved as a result of being exposed to racial violence in the media. Black parents who were also traumatized by their own experiences with racial discrimination were engaged in more sort of hyper-vigilant parenting. What's interesting about this is that frequency differed. So Black parents who reported this higher levels of racial discrimination. And again, because this is common everyday stressor, they were less likely to be involved vigilant. So they didn't have this sort of hyper-vigilant parenting. But for sure, those who were bothered by racism, they were more likely to be involved in terms of this hyper-vigilant way. So it's being exposed to racial violence, it's being traumatized by racial violence, it's being bothered by racial violence, which makes parents sort of hyper-vigilant and feeling as if they have to monitor and sort of be involved in their Black child's life. And so again, sort of these findings are matters, and they're very important. And so lastly, let's talk about this last interaction that was significant. And so what's interesting here is that, and this is just for the low slope, you all, when racial discrimination is low, meaning if parents are not as bothered by discrimination, and then they also are not as traumatized by discrimination, they're less likely to be hypervigilant. And so it's only in the presence of if they're highly traumatized by discrimination, if they're bothered by discrimination, and if they're exposed to racial violence in the media, do they feel like they have to be hypervigilant. And so what do these findings tell us? First of all, that parents' own race-related experiences, how they perceive race, how they're coping with race, impacts their confidence, skills, and them sort of preparing their child to address inequities. And so what we found was that the frequency of discrimination was associated with feeling more confident, having more skills, and preparing a child to address inequities for parents. However, being bothered was associated with being less likely to feel confident. This resulted in them feeling less skillful and resulted in parents not really encouraging their child to address inequities. And also parents' race-related experiences and racial violence was associated with more involved vigilant parenting. And I also want to note that because we found that Black parents who reported higher levels of experiencing racism, even though they felt more confident, skillful, and reported higher levels of a call to action, I want you all to note that this doesn't mean that Black parents are okay. I think these findings have implications on the health outcomes, how Black parents sort of are internalizing their stressors. It also brings me to the research of sort of physiological responses around heart disease, around hypertension, in terms of how Black parents are doing. Again, just because it's higher levels of racial discrimination that Black parents are engaged in, I don't want the audience to leave with this idea that Black folks are superheroes, because they're not. It's just because racial discrimination is an everyday common stressor that Black parents feel as if they can share this experience with their child. So I just want to make that finding clear. And also in alignment with recast, this suggests that both the direct and vicarious experiences of racial discrimination can result in the manifestation of race-based traumatic stress. And so it's important that we have this particular scale, because there are some parents that we're hypothesizing that are in the clinical range of race-based PTSD. And so this is also something to be to note. But again, this is just our preliminary findings. We're very excited about where this work is going to take us, because it's also about helping families in real time as well too. And so what's the next steps for this work? And so we want to consider adolescent gender. There is some research that suggests that Black mothers and Black fathers are having different conversations with their children. And there's some research around that. For example, that Black parents are more likely to talk about racial pride with Black girls, and with Black boys, it's like this idea of having more conversations around racial barriers in society. We also want to look at the different responses according to rural, urban, and suburban communities in Missouri. We also want to consider unique parent-child dyads. Even though our sample was 55% mothers, we did have grandmothers complete, aunts, uncles complete surveys. And so it would be interesting, and fathers as well too. So it'll be very interesting to sort of look at that sort of dyadic relationship, and how sort of the confidence level was, or that parent's own racialized experience sort of differed whether it was a mother-son or a father-son relationship. And again, as I stated at the beginning, we're gearing up for year 2 data collection, following back up those families. And then also, I want to note this is a mixed method study. And so although we have data, quantitative data, we will also be taking a subset of those families, and we're going to be interviewing them as well to sort of get more in depth as well with some of our questions, and to really understand how racism is traumatic for Black families. And so this is the actual design of it. I just want to show you all that. Today I presented on parents' race-related experience as a subset of that in terms of how that impacted their parenting practices and socialization. But we also do have reports from adolescents in terms of how this messaging is shaping their socio-political knowledge and Black youth activism, their well-being, their academic, their racial identity beliefs, and how they're perceiving these messages from their parents. And also with Black parents, we're now sort of looking at the ways in which they sort of cope with these particular stressors too. So this is a large study, and I just presented a subset of the findings today. And so also I wanted to sort of do a shameless plug on where this work has led me. And so I will be hosting a podcast. It is co-hosting a podcast with Dr. Adams Bass at Rutgers University. This is executive produced by Jacqueline Doogie. She is a renowned pediatrician who wrote a seminal report on the impact of racism on child and adolescent health. And she also talks with families about how to talk to their children about racial bias in America. And so I am going to be doing a year-long podcast, co-hosting it with her and inviting different Black families on so we can really talk about what works for our community and what does not work, and just sort of centering the resistance and the resilience narratives of Black families. So I'm really excited about this as well. And so, I think that is it for me today. Thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheretta. It's always a pleasure to have you with us and sharing all of your research that you do and you have done and will continue to do in helping support our people of color and our families that we have here. So I have a few questions for you. You ready?
I'm so ready. Question.
So the first one was they wanted to know, where did you get that lovely clip that you showed that talked about the talk? We did have a person is in attendance today did share that link. I'm going to reshare it for you, but can you tell us more about where you found it?
I think it's Procter & Gamble, I want to say, but it happened around, oh my gosh, I got this clip maybe in 2016 because this work was relevant then. And so I just always show it because I think it's a good way to sort of talk about the diversity and the ways in which parents are having conversations with their child about race. So that's you talk about the racial socialization clip, right?
Yes.
So that's
all right. So I did share a link to that for you all in the chat. If you need to use that for any of your personal use, or you want to share it with others, please do.
Yes.
So let's get into the questions now. So there was, I'm not sure if you had a chance to even glance at the chat while you were speaking.
I have not. I did not see it.
But it was a beautiful conversation about how parents can talk to their children, when to start talking to them, and just advice given. It was great. So I pulled some of the questions from some of the things that people said. Yeah. So the first one was worrying about when to have these conversations. If it's too early, are you setting them up to look at people differently? Are you actually helping them out? So how do you walk that line between when to have the talk, when it's helpful, when it could be harmful?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So unfortunately, Black families don't have a choice in terms of when or how we start to have conversations with Black children. Because if we look at some of the research findings, Black boys at ages 4 or 5 have some of the highest suspension rates in the US in terms of being kicked out of school. There's research studies to show the ways in which Black girls are adultified and Black boys are adultified as well in terms of society believing that they're older than what they already are. And so because of those sort of racialized experiences, Black parents have always had to contend with when to begin to have this conversation. And so for me, even, using my own experience, having 2 Black daughters, I've had to have this conversation when they were 4 or 5, because they were coming home, speaking about the treatment in terms of what they were getting within their preschool classroom from their peers. And so for us, it really isn't this, when do we have a conversation? Because what we also know is that Black parents not having a conversation about racial socialization sort of impacts and is detrimental to Black youth, because they're going out in the world believing that everything is fair, but when they run into, whether it is a police interaction or run into being sort of racialized and sort of stereotyped, they aren't able to deal with it. But I would say to parents, have a conversation with your child about their schooling experiences. If you are at a youth serving organization, create space intentionally for youth to begin to talk about their different social identities and how that might show up. I think we will all be surprised at when children are ready to have the talk, because a lot of it is fears from parents about what to say or what to do. And I also say for white parents, they need to be having a conversation with their child about race as well, in terms of differences. So again, I don't know if there's if I can say a set age, but I think it's a conversation we need to be having, if that makes sense.
Totally agree with you. I have a 7-year-old son at home, so always thinking of those conversations and when to have them, and how that conversation is going to unfold. Absolutely. Right? Absolutely. So going to your study, so did your study look at how many protective factors the families who had more experience but less rumination had versus the other families? Great
question. And so we literally cleaned this data like a month ago, because it was so much data, and it was some of it that was still coming in. We do have protective factors. We have the coping that I just showed on the screen in terms of, the coping processes in terms of the way in which they use their families, their peers, and then sort of the other sort of resources that are available to them as well. We definitely have that. In addition to that, we're also leaving room open through our mixed methodology to sort of probe further and to ask parents to name specifically the protective mechanisms that they use and the resources. Again, going back to the model, it is very culturally strength-based. And so to center the narratives of Black families is what we're going to be doing through the mixed methods. So we're going to get, in addition to what the science says, I want to be able to hear Black parents' voices and sort of naming their protective mechanisms in their community, so we can name it and sort of put it in a scientific outlet that's sort of designed by them as well, and sort of centers their voices.
Thank you so much. This is a related question. So were there any exploration into what contributed to rather parents felt bothered by interactions or not, which goes into what protective factors contributed to feeling less bothered by racial discrimination?
So great question. And so usually, and I hope this answers their question. And so usually when we give a scale, especially the racial discrimination scale, the purpose and the intent of it is to understand different racialized experiences in terms of the frequency, but yet how bothered they were by that. That's a quantitative, right? So that's a survey. And so let me step back. We're doing an explanatory sequential mixed methods design. The purpose of that is to use the survey data, answer questions from get the findings from the survey data, and then develop questions that probe further. And so to that response, in terms of parents being bothered and sort of ruminating and being traumatized by discrimination, the interview piece will help us dissect that a bit further. And I also want to note that this is the first study, longitudinal study, with an N of this size with Black families to understand that. So there's no research on that yet. So again, this is important for us to let Black families sort of name in real time what is it that what's particularly bothersome to them about it? But let me just say this, racism is a stressor, period. There's no low level, high level, it just shouldn't be happening. Racism impacts folks. Everybody deals with racism in a very, very different way. Black people are not a monolith. And so I just kind of want to say that as well too. I hope that answered the question.
I believe it did. And if the person that asked it wants to clarify or let us know in the chat, please let us know if you need more clarification or not. So this is I guess a selfish question on my behalf, but I mentioned I have a 7-year-old who's also special needs. So does your project, or maybe in the future, do you touch on any intersections between race and disability?
Absolutely. So a couple of questions. So great answer, couple of comments. I'm really excited about this. And so the PI, I want to give a shout out to her, Shauna Lee. Our purpose of the mixed method study is to understand the intersectional experiences of Black families. What is it like to be Black and have a disability? What is it like to be Black and LGBT? Because we also know that Black trans lives are not showing up in the way that they need to show up, and that parents, some Black parents, are having specific conversations around different social identities. All of that sort of will probe further when we do the mixed method study. The first step was the survey data. The next step is for us really to center families and get to know them more and to find that out. But that is an amazing question. And also, you all, I want to say, anytime you add disability with the race, the outcomes are exacerbated in very negative ways. And so that's something that we absolutely need to do. And thank you for bringing that up too.
You are welcome. Yeah, I have one final question that kind of wraps this all up, and then we can be respectful of everyone's time. So what kinds of resources are available to provide help to parents that want to have these conversations with their children? Is there any insight about like school environment and things of that nature? Is what is out there to help?
I was going to say, so if you go to Google, there is a lot of information that's available for parents around the talk, and that's kind of what it's labeled. And so using that sort of search term, the talk, and even racial socialization, when is the best time? There are several entities, the one I just shared, how parents are talking about teaching racial bias with their children, that's led by Jacqueline Doogie. There's a lot of pediatricians, a lot of family engagement community specialists, a lot of developmental psychologists that have information that's out there to help you all and to guide you all in having these difficult conversations. In our school environment, I believe these conversations should be happening, but because of the current political state that we're in around DEI being taken out, around the banning of AP African-American history, even what's happening in our own backyard in terms of Rockwood School District, these conversations are going to be increasingly difficult to have in an educational space. So what I encourage parents to do is to rally, to get together, to create youth advisory, advocacy groups, whether you meet at a local library, whether you meet, bring this up to your board. The conversation and having the discussions about this is particularly important. So I do want to note how Google is a platform, but also how these conversations might be construed in the educational space where everything around EDI is being attacked right now.
Yeah, I totally hear you. It's really hard to find a safe space to have a safe and brave space to have these conversations.
Absolutely.
Because yeah, I totally agree. Well, let me turn it back over to Sarah to close us out. And again, thank you so much, Sheretta, for your presentation. Thank you everyone in attendance as well.
Thank you all for having me.
I'm just going to add my thanks as well. Thank you, Dr. Butler-Barnes, for all the excellent research and work you and your colleagues did, and of course for sharing it with us today. And thanks everybody in the chat. There was a really great chat going on. Thank you for your vulnerability and your sharing with each other. Just a reminder that we were recording today, so a recording of this program will be available on our YouTube page along with all of the other Open Classroom recordings. Give us about 2 days to get that up. Somebody asked about any additional resources. We can get together with Dr. Barnes to see if there's anything that you want to, and we can share that as well.
Yeah.
And then please, we have 3 more Black History Month open classrooms coming up. The next one is a week from today. So that's Wednesday, February 8th. It is with Dr. Erica Bumpers, and the program is called From Darkness to Light, Examining Oppression and Liberation Through Poetry. So I'll put a link for you to register for those upcoming programs as well. Everybody have a great rest of your day, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you all.
Thank you.